I'm writing this like I was trained to document incidents. Plain language, a paper trail when possible, and enough detail that a denial has to work hard. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was hired as the site compliance officer for a new regional hospital outside a Midwestern county seat, on land the city kept calling reclaimed, so often it started to sound like a spell. The project was already underway when I arrived, officially behind schedule, unofficially stuck in a loop of small, courteous failures that repeated like policy. The first week it was the survey stakes. They didn't vanish, they didn't get kicked over. They shifted, an inch here, 2 inches there, overnight, never the same direction twice, like a hand nudging chess pieces between turns. The foreman blamed teenagers, the surveyor blamed wind, the superintendent blamed the surveyor. I blamed the kind of chaos that happens when you put too many contractors on the same dirt and expect a clean line.
Then I walked the eastern quadrant. Nothing about it looked different. Same clay, same rough grading, same temporary fencing and orange flags. But the moment I crossed an invisible edge, I felt it in my teeth. A low hum with no source. Not loud, not even truly audible. A vibration that lived in enamel more than ears, like the ground was using my jaw as a tuning fork. I stopped, waited for it to fade, and it didn't. It simply held steady, patient, indifferent, until I stepped back 2 paces and felt it loosen, like a belt being unbuckled 1 notch. The crew didn't talk about it. They just drifted away from that area with an instinctive half-step, the way people avoid the exact center of a room where a fight happened yesterday. They traded tasks. They found reasons. Headache, nausea, my chest feels wrong. I wrote those words down, then translated them into compliance language. Fatigue, heat stress, schedule pressure.
That's what you do when you're paid to keep panic from becoming a line item. The timing didn't show itself until Wednesday. At 2:17 p.m., the hum tightened. Not louder, tighter, like the vibration narrowed into a more precise frequency. You could see it in people's posture. A pause mid-step, a glance toward nothing. A tool set down carefully as if the ground might notice carelessness. At 2:18, it eased again, and conversations restarted with that false brightness people use after they've all felt something together and agreed not to name it. I began checking my watch without meaning to. Thursday, same thing, 2:17. Friday, 2:17. It didn't matter if it was sunny or raining, if the crew was loud or quiet, if machines were running or idling. The hum tightened on schedule like it had a meeting to keep. That should have been enough to make me request reassignment. Instead, I did what compliance people do. I tried to make it measurable.
I walked the eastern quadrant with a decibel meter, a vibration sensor, and a phone app that claimed it could detect low-frequency oscillations. The devices behaved normally until 2:17. Then my phone froze for a single beat, like a blink that wasn't mine, and the time displayed on the screen read 2:17, even though my wristwatch still read 2:12. 5 seconds later, the phone corrected itself to 2:12, as if it had done me a favor. The hum, however, tightened anyway, as if the ground didn't care what my electronics pretended. That weekend, our blueprints started changing. Not dramatic redesigns, corrections. Angles tightened by fractions, corridors shortened by inches. Clearances nudged so they sat just shy of code compliance. Never enough to fail outright, always enough to force revision. Every correction pulled inward toward the eastern quadrant, like the project had a center it wanted to protect. The plotter didn't show a job ticket. The revision history didn't show an author.
It was simply there Monday morning, a clean sheet set, warm from the printer, with a smell like fresh toner and damp paper. In the margin, in a font none of us used, one phrase sat like a stamped verdict: compliance pending. I spent that day chasing the obvious explanations. I pulled network logs, I called IT, I asked who had access to the plotter queue. I checked the locked trailer doors for signs of tampering. Nothing. The printer's internal log showed it had printed the sheets at 2:17 p.m. on Sunday. No one was on site Sunday. The gate code records proved it. The security cameras, when I rewound them to Sunday afternoon, showed the trailer exterior for hours without interruption. No one entered, no one left. At 2:17, the image stuttered for less than a second, like a dropped frame, and when it resumed, the trailer light was on, even though it had been off the whole day. It stayed on for exactly 1 minute. At 2:18, it was off again.
I paused the video, leaned closer, and realized the door to the trailer was slightly ajar in the resumed frame, open just enough to suggest someone had stepped through, but not enough to show a body. I watched that minute again and again. Nothing moved. No shadow crossed. No wind pushed the door wider. The light stayed on with the stubborn steadiness of a room being used. That night, I took the revised blueprints home and spread them across my kitchen table, tracing the changes with a ruler, like that could restore order. Every line led inward. Every compromise pointed toward the eastern quadrant. I checked the time without thinking. It was 2:16 a.m., nowhere near the scheduled hour, and still my teeth ached as if the hum had followed me. I told myself it was stress. I told myself I was tired. I told myself a building site can't choose. Then my phone vibrated once. No notification, no call, just a single pulse like someone tapping a clipboard. The screen lit up by itself.
The clock displayed 2:17, and on the table, on the edge of the top blueprint sheet, a faint rectangle of darker shadow formed, as if cast by a wall that wasn't there, perfectly proportioned, perfectly oriented, like an intake room outline laid across my kitchen wood. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited for it to fade. It didn't. It only sharpened, like the shape was learning how to stay. By Monday, I was treating the project like an investigation instead of a job. I stopped assuming the simplest explanation, because the simplest explanation kept breaking in the same place. The revised sheet set was still in the plotter tray when I arrived, warm-smelling and smug, and the foreman tried to joke that maybe the architects had finally gotten serious over the weekend. I didn't laugh. I checked the plotter's internal log again. Sunday, 2:17 p.m. I checked the security footage again. The same missing beat, the same 1-minute light, the same door not quite open, the way a mouth rests between words. I did the thing compliance people do when they're cornered by something they can't write in an email. I created a parallel record. Paper, ink, dates, signatures. 2 witnesses per entry, if I could get them. If reality was going to argue with me, I wanted a paper trail that would make it sweat. At 2:10 p.m., I walked the eastern quadrant with a clipboard and a steel tape, because steel is honest in a way software isn't. I marked a radius from the planned center point, one of those reference pins every crew learns to respect, and I measured outward in 3 directions. I wrote the numbers down. I told myself I'd come back tomorrow and prove it was ordinary drift. The hum was faint at first, like background pressure you forget is there until it changes. At 2:16, a few workers drifted away without being asked. At 2:17, the hum tightened and the air took on that heavier quality again, like humidity without moisture. My teeth felt it first, then the soft tissue behind my eyes, like someone gently pressing from the inside. I looked up at the fencing and saw shadows aligning into a shape that didn't belong to any object casting it. A clean rectangle, corners too precise to be chance, sitting across bare earth like an outline of a room. I stared until my eyes watered, then forced myself to look away and back to confirm I wasn't hallucinating. The rectangle stayed. It wasn't chalk, it wasn't paint, it was absence arranged into geometry. A new subcontractor, young, confident, from out of state, walked toward the rectangle like he wanted to prove something. He crossed the invisible edge and immediately stopped, frowning, one hand going to his jaw as if he'd bitten down too hard. He took a half step backward and his shoulders relaxed. He took a half step forward and his shoulders rose again.
He looked at me like I'd planned it. "What is that?" he asked, pointing at the blank ground as if the rectangle were obvious to everyone. I told him it was nothing. I told him to stay on the west side. I wrote down his name anyway, because witnesses matter even when they don't want to be witnesses. At 2:18, the hum loosened. The rectangle softened, like a bruise fading, but it did not fully disappear. It lingered at the edge of perception, the way a threat lingers at the edge of a conversation. When I looked down at my tape measure, the numbers were wrong. Not by much, by inches, but wrong in a way that made my stomach drop. The distance I had measured from the center reference pin to my current position had changed while I stood there. I measured again, different number. Again, different number. I stepped 1 pace back, measured, closer. 1 pace forward, measured, farther. It was inverted. Space was behaving like it had preferences.
I wrote it down in pen so hard the paper tore. because I needed the physical act to convince me it was happening. "Tape stretched," my brain offered. "You're holding it wrong." I swapped tapes with another crew member. Same result. We both stared at the line like it had insulted us. The only thing that stayed consistent was the timing. At 2:17, the world got picky. After lunch, I ordered a core sample from just outside the rectangle's faint boundary. Routine procedure, nothing dramatic. The drill bit came up warm, not friction warm, body warm, and the smell hit us immediately. Damp paper and iron, like a basement with old files and rusted pipes. Along the bit clung a fine black residue that didn't smear like soil. It behaved like it preferred straight lines. When we set the bit down on a clean tarp, the residue didn't slump or scatter. It arranged itself into narrow bands, evenly spaced, as if someone had dragged a comb through powder.
I didn't say anything for a few seconds because naming it felt like giving it permission. Then I did what compliance people do. I treated it like evidence. Bag, label, photos with scale reference, chain of custody form, courier manifest, 2 signatures. I hand-delivered it to the site office safe and locked it until the courier arrived. I watched the courier sign. I watched him load the package. I watched his van leave through the gate. I wrote the time down, 3:07 p.m., because I didn't want the number 217 touching this part of the record if I could avoid it. The lab called the next day and said they'd never received any sample. I argued until my throat hurt. I faxed the manifest. They insisted the tracking number didn't exist in their system. I called the courier company. The tracking number existed. It showed delivered, signed for by a name no one at the lab recognized. I asked for a signature image. They sent it. The signature looked like mine.
Not close to mine. Like mine with my exact pressure habits, my exact crookedness on the last letter. I stared at it until my eyes stung, and then I did the only thing that made sense. I drove to the lab myself. The receptionist pulled up the delivery record and showed me an empty screen. No entry, no scan, no package. I showed her the manifest. She glanced at it like it was a joke she didn't understand and said, gently, "Sir, this paper is blank." I looked down. The manifest in my hands, my copy, was blank. The ink was gone, as if it had never been printed. My fingers left smudges on clean paper. I flipped it over. Nothing. I opened my binder. The photos were there. The chain of custody form was there. The manifest page existed, filed in the right spot with the right date tab. Blank. I drove back to the site shaking. At 2:17 the next day, the hum tightened again, and my phone vibrated once, with no notification, like a reminder that some things didn't need evidence to keep their schedule. And that night, when I opened my laptop to type a report, every file I'd created about the sample corrupted at the same line. The timestamp on each one reading 2:17, no matter what time it actually was, as if the system had chosen a single minute to be its signature and wanted my records to carry it. I started sleeping in my truck, not every night, just enough to catch the site in the hours when human routines loosen and machines have fewer excuses. I parked where the security cameras could see me because I wanted the footage to witness my own choices. The first night, nothing happened except the usual settling noises of a construction site cooling down, metal contracting, tarps snapping, distant highway hush. Around 2:10 a.m., the air shifted. It wasn't temperature, it was pressure, like someone had changed the rules for how far sound could travel. Then, at 2:17 a.m. sharp, the hum tightened so hard my molars ached. The vibration felt cleaner at night, less diluted by daytime chaos.
It was precise, purposeful. The trailer office light flicked on. 1 minute. Off. No movement on camera. No door swing. Just a room being used for exactly 60 seconds. I got out of my truck and walked toward the trailer. My body wanted to stop at the edge, like my muscles recognized a boundary before my thoughts did. I forced myself forward. The hum tightened. My vision tunneled a fraction, not like fainting, like focusing too hard. I reached the trailer steps and saw the door. It was closed. I put my hand on the knob. It was warm, not sun warm, hand warm, as if someone had just let go. I didn't turn it. I don't have a heroic reason. I just didn't. I went back to my truck and watched the minute pass on my dashboard clock. 2:18. The hum loosened. The trailer light stayed off. The next morning, the security footage showed me stepping onto the trailer steps at 2:17, and then nothing. Not a cut, not a glitch. Smooth footage of an empty lot for a full minute.
At 2:18, the footage returned to normal and I was back at my truck, closing the door, exactly as I remembered. But there was no record of the walk, no shadow, no motion blur. The camera had watched an empty scene while my memory insisted I was in it. That was the first time I seriously considered the possibility that the site wasn't moving, it was editing. Not the way a person edits, more like a system correcting data so the output matches what it expects. I began testing the boundary during the day. I brought a GPS unit, 2 steel tapes, and a surveyor willing to get paid to pretend he wasn't scared. We marked the planned center point. We measured a fixed radius line with paint, a wide arc like a smile across dirt. Then we walked the arc together, staying on the line. Every few yards, we checked our distance to the center. For most of the curve, the numbers matched with intolerances. As we approached the eastern quadrant, the numbers drifted. Not gradually, in steps.
Like a staircase you couldn't see. The surveyor swore under his breath and tried a different unit. Same result. We checked the center point pin. It hadn't moved. We checked our paint arc. It was where we'd drawn it. The distance changed anyway. Then we tried something simple. We moved the center point. Not physically, on paper. We told the system we were using a different reference. The moment we did, the drift shifted to match. It was as if the boundary wasn't protecting a spot in dirt. It was protecting the idea of the center we were trying to define. Every time we tried to pin it down, it corrected us. That evening, I moved my trailer office again, without authorization, just to see if it mattered. I relocated it 20 yards west. At 2:17 the next day, the hum tightened in the exact same way, and the faint rectangle shadow formed again. Not where it used to, but adjusted, as if the intake had recalculated to maintain the same relationship to the planned center.
The boundary hadn't followed the trailer. It had followed the plan. That night, I opened my binder and found a new page filed neatly between 2 entries. It was my paper, my binder clip, my handwriting. The ink looked fresh. The sentence was short, calm, administrative. Center updated. Boundary maintained. Under it, thank you. I tore the page out, crumpled it, and threw it away. In the morning, the page was back in the binder, uncrumpled, perfectly flat, as if my refusal had been reviewed and corrected. The wall showed up on a Tuesday morning, like a mistake that no one wanted to claim. Temporary drywall, clean cuts, neat screws, placed exactly where the planned operating theater met the invisible boundary. No paperwork, no delivery slip, no work order. The superintendent assumed a subcontractor had jumped ahead. The subcontractor swore he hadn't. The foreman blamed the night crew. The night crew said there was no night crew. I stood in front of the wall and felt the hum in my teeth, even though it wasn't 2:17, and that was new. The vibration was faint but present, like the site had decided it didn't need to be punctual anymore to make its point. I put my palm against the drywall. Warm, not sun warm, body warm. The temperature didn't radiate outward the way heat does. It held steady, as if the wall itself had a regulated internal state. I leaned in and listened. At first I heard nothing but my own breathing and distant machinery. Then, behind the drywall, a muffled rhythm emerged, subtle, regular, patient. Not quite a sound, more like pressure changes, the way you can feel bass through a car door before you hear the song. It matched the cadence of the hum when it tightened, a slow diagnostic pulse. I stepped back and the sensation eased, like the wall had a preferred distance too. I ordered it removed, not because I had authority over drywall, because I needed to see what was being hidden.
The crew started dismantling it panel by panel. As soon as the first sheet came away, the hum tightened. Not at 2:17, right then. Tools caused midair. One worker looked at me and shook his head once, as if warning me without using words. The space behind the drywall was wrong. It was smaller than it should have been. Measurements refused to add up. The operating theater footprint on our plans could not fit into the cavity revealed behind the partition. Corners met where corners shouldn't exist. Angles were a fraction too sharp. The air inside the cavity felt stale, but not dusty. Stale like a room that had been closed with intent. As we removed more panels, the cavity didn't expand the way it should. It held its dimensions stubbornly, like it had already been decided. Then we found the floor. Bare earth. But not bare earth the way a construction site has bare earth.
This soil was smoothed, compacted, almost polished, and on it lay a rectangle of darker shadow that didn't match the light in the room. The outline was larger than the one I'd seen outside in the eastern quadrant, overlapping, like intake had been expanded. One worker muttered a prayer. Another laughed once, then stopped, as if the sound didn't belong. I crouched and held my flashlight over the soil. The shadow didn't move with the beam. It stayed anchored to the ground like a stain that wasn't a stain. The hum tightened until my vision prickled. My phone vibrated once, no notification, and when I looked at the screen, the time read 2:17. It corrected itself a second later. The shadow remained. We backed out of the cavity. We didn't run. We didn't scream. We retreated like professionals, pretending the slow pace made it normal. The superintendent told the crew to stop work and call the city. I told him to lock the area down. He asked me, finally, what I thought was happening.
I opened my mouth and realized there was no compliant language for a room outline made of shadow that didn't care about light. So I said the only thing I could say without lying. The site is building something we didn't approve. That evening, the plotter printed a new revision with no job ticket. The operating theater was no longer drawn where it had been. It had been shifted to match the cavity's wrong geometry. The plan had been corrected to fit the space. In the margin, in that unfamiliar font, 2 lines now sat where there had been 1. Compliance accepted. Intake expanded. After the wall, the site stopped pretending it was only punctual. The hum no longer waited politely for 2:17 to make itself known. It was there in the background like a low-pressure system, and it tightened whenever we did something that tried to define the space. Measure it, mark it, name it, commit it to paper. I doubled down on the real record anyway.
2 notebooks now. One for official logs, one for what I could never say out loud in a meeting. I wrote with a ballpoint so the ink would dent the page. I numbered entries, I initialed the corners, I photographed each page with a separate phone that never connected to Wi-Fi. It didn't matter. The site began negotiating my words while I slept. The first time I noticed, it was almost insulting in its subtlety. I'd written, unscheduled drywall partition discovered, no work order, warm to the touch, audible rhythmic pressure behind panel. The next morning it read, temporary partition discovered, work order pending verification, slight warmth noted. My handwriting, my ink, my pressure habits. The meaning sanded down to something safe. I flipped back through earlier pages and found other edits. Urgency softened, certainty replaced with cautious language, like a supervisor rewriting a report to avoid liability. I tried to tell myself I'd done it in a fog of exhaustion.
Then I found a sentence I would never have chosen. Recommend compliance with revised geometry. At 2:17 that day, the hum tightened hard enough to make my tongue taste pennies. The rectangle shadow inside the cavity sharpened, even though we'd blocked the opening with plywood and caution tape. The plywood didn't stop the shadow. It didn't stop the warmth either. You could feel it through the boards like a sleeping animal's breath. One of the laborers, older, local, quiet, asked if I ever heard of a place that makes rooms without walls. I told him no. He nodded like he hadn't expected honesty and said, "It's not making rooms, it's making paths." That afternoon, I took a steel tape and walked the perimeter of the quadrant again, forcing myself to move slowly and deliberately. I wanted the numbers to betray themselves on my terms. I measured from the center reference pin to a stake line we'd painted. The distance changed by inches, while the tape stayed taut. I measured again.
Different number. I walked 3 paces north and measured. Different again, but the drift was consistent in one way. It always maintained a certain relationship between me and the dead zone, as if the site preferred me at a specific distance. When I stepped closer, the hum tightened and my eyes watered. When I stepped back, it loosened like approval. I tried an experiment that felt stupid as soon as I began. I spoke out loud. Not into a recorder, not into an official meeting voice, Just a plain sentence, aimed at the empty air. "What do you want?" I said. The words sounded ridiculous the moment they left my mouth. Nothing answered, no whisper, no voice. But the hum tightened, and the fencing shadows outside shifted into a corridor-like shape instead of a rectangle, longer, narrower, leading from the quadrant toward where our main entrance would eventually stand. The shape wasn't drawn by anything visible. It was made of absence arranged into meaning.
I stood there, jaw aching, watching a path being implied for me, like a suggestion I hadn't asked for. That night, I locked both notebooks in the site safe and took the key home. I wanted one clean victory. The site could change my files, my devices, my printouts, but it couldn't change a locked box I controlled. At 2:17 a.m., I woke with pressure behind my eyes and the sense of being observed not by a presence, but by a process. My phone vibrated once with no notification. I didn't need to check the time to know what it would say. In the dark, my jaw hummed. I got up, went to the kitchen, and found my work key on the counter, though I remembered putting it in my pocket. It lay beside a sheet of paper I hadn't brought home. On it was a single sentence in my handwriting, ink still glossy. Key access granted. When I drove to the site before dawn, the safe was unlocked. The notebooks were inside, neatly stacked, as if nothing had happened. I opened the real one with shaking hands.
Several new pages had been filled in overnight. My handwriting, my ink. Calm, clinical, as if written by someone with my hand, but without my fear. The last line on the last new page read, "Intake procedure initiated." Under it, "Do not resist correction." The city called an emergency coordination meeting, which meant a conference room, a projector, and people trying to find an explanation that wouldn't get them sued. They wanted engineering answers, soil anomalies, groundwater, subsurface voids. They wanted manageable language. I brought printed photos of the shadow outlines and the altered pages from my notebook because I was still naive enough to think proof mattered. In the meeting, my photos displayed fine. The room listened politely. A consultant nodded and asked technical questions. Then the deputy city manager requested the originals for the record. I handed over the prints. He looked down, frowned, and said, "These are blank." I snatched them back. The glossy photo paper in my hand was white. No image, no outline, just my fingerprints in the wrong places. I pulled my phone to show the images from the gallery. The folder opened, the thumbnails existed for half a second, then they refreshed into great placeholders with timestamps that read 2:17, as if the files had been saved at the same minute in a loop. I felt heat rise up my neck like I was being made a fool of on purpose. The only evidence that survived the room was the one thing nobody wanted to touch, the new blueprint revisions the plotter kept producing. Those prints were physical enough to be shared and official enough to be discussed. The city's lead architect insisted they hadn't issued them. IT insisted there was no remote access. The plotter vendor insisted the logs showed local printing events. The deputy manager insisted we stop using the word unauthorized and start using unverified. And all the while, the revisions kept doing the same thing, pulling the hospital inward, narrowing corridors, shifting entrances, recentering flow. Not to meet code, to meet something else. They approved a decisive intervention, which meant forcing a confrontation with the boundary until it yielded a clean explanation. Ground-penetrating radar, boreholes, invasive testing. The schedule was set deliberately for 1:49 a.m., chosen to avoid 2:17, the way you avoid a known storm window. I stayed on site anyway. I told myself that if something went wrong, I had to witness it unfiltered, away from conference rooms where evidence turned to blank paper. At 1:46, the radar sweeps looked normal. At 1:50, still normal. At 2:12, the air shifted the way it always did, heavier, less forgiving. People started talking a little louder, like volume could keep them brave. At 2:16, the crew's movement slowed without instruction. Tools were handled with careful respect. The hum was already present now, a background pressure that felt like a hand at the back of your neck. At exactly 2:17, every active device on site jumped. Clocks, tablets, machine consoles, every timestamp displayed 2:17 as if the minute had snapped into place and refused to move forward. Alarms chimed politely to announce nothing in particular. The hum tightened into a structured cadence, a pulse with pauses, like a heart at rest. The drilling rig stopped mid-motion, not because it hit rock,
but because it had nowhere else to go, as if the space in front of the bit had been politely removed. The operator tried to retract. The shaft returned measured resistance, responsive, deliberate, like pulling against something that knew exactly how much force to allow. The ground grew subtly warm, not heat from friction, active warmth, regulated. The black residue appeared along the exposed steel in narrow bands, evenly spaced, matching the pulse cadence in the hum.
One consultant reached toward it, then hesitated and whispered, "It feels like breathing." Nobody laughed. Then the rectangle shadow that had haunted the quadrant began to change shape. It lengthened, narrowed, curved. It became a corridor-like absence, bending away from us while maintaining the same distance, never letting itself be crossed directly. It didn't move like a thing. It rearranged the rules of where things could be. The radar screen, which should have shown layers of Earth, displayed repeating patterns stacked over themselves, as if depth had been folded. One consultant muttered that it looked like the site was copying and pasting geology. I tried to step forward, driven by a stupid need to prove I still had agency. The hum tightened hard enough to blur my vision at the edges. My chest felt squeezed. I stepped back, and the pressure eased instantly, like a system adjusting to keep me where it preferred.
That's when the thought landed, cold and clean. It wasn't defending itself. It was teaching. It was showing us the correct distance, the correct flow, the correct path. When the intervention was halted, the equipment powered down obediently, almost politely. Screens went dark. The hum loosened as if satisfied. In the automatically generated logs, a new file appeared with no author. Timestamp 217. It contained a schematic that used our symbols, our legends, our assumptions rearranged into something that made a terrible kind of sense. Intake corridors, holding spaces, recovery rooms that led nowhere, circulation that circled but never reached a true center. On the last page, in plain language like a note left on a clipboard, it read, "Transfer ready." And beneath that, a single line that turned my mouth dry, "Patient, Mercer." They shut the project down within 48 hours, not because anyone admitted what happened, but because the paper trail became radioactive.
Legal teams called it an indefinite suspension. The mayor called it responsible caution. The site called it something else, and it didn't bother using words. Even after the machines were hauled away and the fences came down, the hum stayed, fainter, steadier, like a hospital left running on backup power. I was told to take mandatory leave while the city reviewed my workload. My badge stopped opening doors, my email stopped sending, my name stopped appearing on meeting invites, as if it had been corrected out of the schedule. The last day I was allowed on site, I brought my binder and demanded one thing, a stamped copy of the intervention logs. They handed me a folder. Inside was clean paper, blank. The only ink was a single timestamp in the corner, printed in that unfamiliar font, 217. I quit without a speech. I moved apartments. I switched jobs. I avoided construction sites the way you avoid a street where you were attacked. For a while, it worked.
Then I started noticing the same kinds of corrections elsewhere, small, polite, repeatable. A clinic corridor narrowed by a fraction after renovation. A hospital wing labeled temporarily closed that never reopened. Signs that seemed to shift their arrows when you stared too long. I told myself it was paranoia. I told myself trauma makes patterns. I told myself anything that didn't require admitting the site had learned the language of buildings. A month later, I ended up in a different hospital for something minor, observation only, paperwork and a wristband, nothing dramatic. At 2:16 p.m., the air changed. At 2:17, my jaw hummed. My phone vibrated once with no notification. Across the waiting room, a door I hadn't noticed before sat half open, revealing a corridor that looked too clean, too organized, too quiet, as if it had been waiting for the correct patient to arrive.
A nurse walked past, paused at her clipboard, and frowned like a line item had appeared that she didn't remember adding. She glanced at me, not like she recognized my face, but like she recognized my status. When I was discharged, the paperwork listed no complications.
In the bottom corner, in my handwriting, was a sentence I did not remember writing. Transfer confirmed. I asked for a reprint. The nurse returned with a new copy where the sentence was no longer in the corner. It was centered, bold, as if it had been promoted from a detail to a headline. I tried to photograph it. The camera blinked black for a single beat, like a blink that wasn't line, and the image saved with one detail that never changes anymore. The timestamp read 2:17. That night, in my apartment, the pipes ticked as the building settled. I caught myself counting the gaps between sounds, measuring distance without meaning to. On the third tick, I felt it again in my teeth, the hum without a source, tighter than before, closer than it should have been. I went to my front door and looked down at the threshold. A faint rectangle of darker shadow lay across the floorboards, perfectly proportioned, perfectly oriented, like my home had been quietly rezoned into intake. Somewhere behind the walls, something that didn't need lungs was practicing how to breathe. And the worst part wasn't the fear. It was the calm certainty that the building already knew where to put me.